Thank you very much. What a day, eh? We've had so much law. I didn't think there was that much for me to learn in one day, and I have. And I'd like to thank Catherine as well. And Catherine, you scared me, to be honest, with what you said. If we have an establishment, a state, a power that thinks its foreign policy includes genocide, is it time to tear apart that power, that state, and that establishment? Is that really where we're going to end up? Because where I am, and the way I've engineered my organization, the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians, I think that's where I'm heading really rapidly. I'm a lawyer. I'm a solicitor of the Supreme Court of England and Wales. I'm an officer of the court, which means it's my duty to uphold the rule of law and the principles of justice. It's becoming really difficult. It is becoming really, really difficult. I do not trust our governments. I do not trust them. And I don't trust the institutions that they control. I don't trust them to protect me. I don't trust them to protect you. And I don't trust them to protect Palestinians or anybody else from famine, from devastation, from war crimes, from poverty, from hunger. There is a difference still between the respect that our governments place on international law and the respect they have for domestic law. They treat international law like the Wild West. If I've got the biggest army, if I've got the most powerful country, if I've got the most money, then what I say international law is works. That's the way it works right now. So if I had an army, I can tell you my legal cases would work a lot better than they do at the moment, but I haven't. And those countries that have that army, that have that power, utilize international law in their own interests. But you know what's really scary is because we're going backwards. It can even be argued now that in some instances, respect for domestic law is also breaking down, at least when it comes to applying it to the wealthy and the political class. It's important to understand our government's failure to implement international law and the impact that has on the situation in Palestine, and why domestic remedies are so crucial for accountability and in pushing our governments and institutions to work properly. There are three primary institutions designed to uphold international law: the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and more recently, the International Criminal Court. Now, I did have my original talk, when I started this morning, had an insight into my own universal jurisdiction practice, and I've changed it as I've gone through the day to make what I say different to what everybody else has already told you and more relevant to explaining the position that I've got to now. What the situation in Gaza has demonstrated in visceral detail is the international community's lack of commitment to any real international law-based order, particularly if it would in some way be against their own perceived national interest. It's almost like the West is one body, and that includes Israel in it, engaged in the practice of annihilation of the Palestinian people. Around the globe, world leaders condemned the actions of Hamas for Gaza on October the 7th. And unequivocally championed the right of Israel to defend itself, sending what? A green light to Netanyahu that he was free to reduce Gaza to rubble. And that's what he did. In fact, not only did they send the green light, they supplied Netanyahu with the financial and military means to do exactly that. And they continue to do that now. Western leaders are guilty of viewing Palestine and Israel through the prejudiced prism of the merciless Palestinian terrorist against the gentle Jewish victim who's desperately working to maintain the only democracy in the Middle East. A total fiction, a total lie. They make a political decision, not a legal decision, a political decision to refuse to see Israel as a state carrying out acts of apartheid and engaged in a brutal and belligerent occupation of an indigenous group of people. They make a political decision, not a legal decision, a political decision to refuse to believe that Israel was likely to take action which would be wholly disproportionate to any threat it might actually face. But the risk should have been clear to politicians in my home country of the United Kingdom. because in 2009, I jointly led a legal team in an application in a British court for an arrest warrant for a former Israeli Foreign Minister, Tzipi Livni, for her part in what? In alleged war crimes killing civilians in Gaza during Operation Cast Lead, based on law, the principles of universal jurisdiction, real evidence. A judge granted that warrant because 15 years ago, in 2009, it was clear what Israel was capable of doing. 2009's Operation Cast Lead saw the killing of, just listen to the numbers, okay? 1,400 Palestinians, including 300 children, with over 5,000 injured. And we were outraged. We were outraged. The world was outraged. I can say this now, compared to the numbers now, only 1,400 people. But we were outraged into it. We will never let this happen again. It will be different. Remember this? Remember this. In 2014, just a few years later, it happened again. Israel killed, this time, 2,189 Palestinians, including 513 children, with over 11,000 injured. And we were even more outraged. Even more outraged. But by October 2024, Israel had made clear to the rest of the world what it was prepared to do now that it had suffered 1,200 casualties on its own soil. By June 2024, Israel had so far killed over 38,000 people, mostly women and children. And again, we're outraged, right? We're outraged. It's destroyed the health infrastructure and starved the population of Gaza to the level of famine. People are literally dying of starvation at the behest of Israeli and government policy and military strategy. I mean, the words that I'm saying are phenomenal. You know, you decide as a government, I'm going to starve this group of people to death. And that's what they're doing. And my government, my former government, the current government we'll have yet to see, my former government is complicit, was complicit in that. Now, governments across the world have been complicit in it, and not just Western governments, Middle Eastern governments, Far Eastern governments, African governments. Governments across the world have been complicit in this. We can count on our hands the governments that haven't been complicit in it. Most governments, most of the world have been complicit in it, either because they're interested in that or because they're fearful of the consequences of not. You know, I spoke to a senior state leader, I can't tell you who, and they were fearful that if they stepped out of line with the club, the Western club, the United States would act to overturn their government domestically. And if I told you who the country was, which I can't, you'd be astounded, because that's what America does when people step out of line. But you see, the people's will and view is different to governments. I'm just going to talk about the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, in May, a YouGov poll found most people do not back Israel's war on Gaza, whilst our government did. Most people back a ceasefire, whilst our government didn't really. Most people back the release of hostages, which our government found easy to say it also did. Most people, including those that are more sympathetic to Israel, think that Israel should enter into peace negotiations with Hamas, and that's a surprising finding. But despite this, governments, especially in the West, have made themselves complicit in alleged Israeli war crimes. They have funded and provided political and diplomatic support to Israel. The UN Security Council has failed immeasurably to halt any acts that might plausibly prevent violations of international law. In fact, the Security Council has become a place not where states try to solve the world's problems, but where they try to embarrass each other for political advantage through provocatively worded resolutions, all the while people continue to die. You know, I spoke to a senior American official, is all I'd say, who said to me, yeah, but we wouldn't vote for this because that country was just trying to embarrass us. And I was like, what are you talking about? So what are you talking about? You're playing word games at the Security Council, right? And people are dying. Draft your own bloody resolution that will solve the problem, put it forward. Or just take your army and solve the problem. It's just a lie. It's a game. And all the while, people are dying. But it did take South Africa, a global South country, to trigger the Genocide Convention to try to protect Palestinians from annihilation. The ICJ, I'm going to speak faster because I've got 5 minutes. Fast forward, okay? The ICJ's provisional measures ruling that Palestinians risk genocide at the hands of Israel has been met with word games to diminish its significance. It has resulted in no meaningful action by the Security Council to support its rulings. The ICC chief prosecutor has now issued arrest warrant applications for the arrest of 5 individuals in relation to Gaza. The US and Israel, instead of respecting the ICC mandate, have worked to undermine it. The US has threatened the ICC's officers and their families with action simply for the ICC working to its mandate. In the last days of the dying Tory government, British Foreign Office lawyers were dispatched to the ICC to try to get Israel jurisdictional immunity. It's disgraceful. Nonetheless, the arrest warrants applications and South Africa's case remain historic moments in our human story. But the current proceedings at the UN, ICJ and ICC demonstrate an inherent weakness in the structural protections we have when rights under international humanitarian law are violated. We do not have an independent and objectively operating institution to put into place any practical protections for people when their rights are being violated, even when the allegation is genocide. It's woeful that nearly 80 years after the end of World War II, which saw the annihilation of 6 million Jews, which is a big number and should be enough to stop you in your tracks, but the next number, a death toll of 75 million people, 75 million people, we as the human race still cannot understand the cost of war and have no effective mechanism to prevent vast war and genocide. Do you know what? There is little personal cost to perpetrators for violating international law. On the contrary, the risk-benefit calculation is heavily weighted in favor of committing war crimes for financial, political, and personal gain. The failure of the international institutions to bring any kind of resolution to the killing in Gaza and other places across the globe have left me with an understanding that our institutions are broken and abused by the powerful who wield them in their own interests. The mantra of protecting human beings itself has become a weapon for the wealthy and the powerful to use against the weak. As I said, I do not trust our government or governments or the institutions that control or protect ordinary people from famine, devastation, or war crimes. Those politicians that have aided and abetted or supported the perpetration of war crimes by either providing political cover, encouraging it, or supplying weapons or military to war criminals are themselves war criminals. Make no mistake about this. That means there are war criminals in our leadership institutions across the globe that walk among us in our own countries. The UK and the US, along with others, continue to support and supply weapons and finance to Israel, rendering the decision makers personally liable to the accusations of complicity in war crimes. My experience with the Livni arrest warrant led me to understand that the state could not be relied on to uphold the rule of international law. After the warrant was granted, British politicians worked tirelessly to undo the work that we had done in obtaining that arrest warrant. They changed the law to impose political interference with that process by giving the Attorney General the right to object to a private arrest warrant. After this event, we decided we could not rely on the political class nor the institutions they control to protect ordinary civilians from war crimes and international law violations. That's for that reason we established the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians. We intend to make the cost personal for those perpetrating or complicit in war crimes in a way that our present states and our institutions are failing to do. After the 7th of October, we saw Israel was set on a course of collective punishment against all Palestinians, but not only that, we saw that politicians around the world were set on supporting Israeli military action without restraint, no matter what it was going to be. Within the first week, the ICJP wrote personally and privately to politicians to warn them that they could potentially be complicit. They ignored us, and so we started a public worldwide legal movement. We publicly put politicians on personal notice that this time we would hold them accountable in their own states for supporting Israeli war crimes. Within the same day, some politicians started to heed Israel to comply with international law. At the ICJP, we pledged to make sure politicians complicit in war crimes are held to account in our courts. So at the moment, I'm going to just cut this very short. At the moment, we have a war crimes complaint sitting with Scotland Yard in respect to 5 former Tory ministers who we say are complicit in Israeli war crimes by either supplying weapons, supplying political support or supplying financial or military support. Now, those 5 ministers are out of office, and the mistake we've made in the past is to only attack the actors in the theatre of war. This is a change. We are going to continue to pursue those individuals now they're out of office. In an interview I did earlier this week, the interviewer asked me if I thought Keir Starmer was a war criminal. And what I replied to that was, well, he made a statement on a radio interview about the blockade and Israel's right to have the blockade, which showed an intention that he could potentially be a war criminal if his actions in government followed that. And I'm waiting to see. Because if Keir Starmer and David Lammy continue to support Israeli war crimes, we will do to them exactly what we're doing to the 5 Tory ministers, and we will issue criminal complaints in the United Kingdom against them. But not only that, we intend to ensure that our criminal complaints are spread across the globe in a project that we have at the RCIJ, which we term the Global 193. We intend to lodge our complaints with every law enforcement agency in the globe and try to push those law enforcement agencies to take domestic legal action with regards to Israeli war criminals, but also those complicit in it from their own countries and our countries. Now, let me tell you this. One country that we've been speaking to at cabinet level are considering joining the Rome Statute to prosecute Israeli war criminals. Another country has assured me that it will take the evidence, this is at cabinet level, will take the evidence, consider it, and order its prosecution service and police to investigate, and if appropriate, issue a red notice in respect not only of Israeli suspected war criminals, but British and others too. We need to make this change. We need to push domestic remedies across the globe. I'm just going to finish with these few words. So we've met so far on a one-to-one level 30 representatives from heads of state, foreign minister, to ambassador, and some countries that you'd be surprised about, which I can't tell you. We've had private meetings with these individuals. A single message to them, which is being received well, by the way, is that this time we must use international law to hold Israel accountable for its alleged war crimes. We cannot allow international law to be ignored or abused. Israel can no longer be gifted impunity, and where our international institutions fail, we must act on a domestic level. You see why? The recipe for peace is not difficult. What's missing is the political will for peace. What's the cure? It's a rules-based accountability structure which applies equally to Palestinians and Israelis, recognition of the state of Palestine, and equality before the law for Palestinians and Israelis. Without this formula, there can be no basis for peace. If you remove accountability, you leave violence. Don't complain about October the 7th if you don't give Palestinians an alternative route through equality in the law, because you leave violence. But do you know what? Missing and misunderstood by the West is that that violence will come to our shores, and we don't want that either. You have to allow equality before the law. You have to allow an alternative. And if our governments have forgotten the pain that led to the creation of international law and necessity of accountability, we must stand in their place in every workplace, in every institution, and every court to do their work in spite of them. Thank you.